Hello, welcome to Wednesday, Wildcard Wednesday here at Bible Story Children's Time. And we're going to look at something I think is kind of interesting today. Maybe it's a little geeky, but I think it's an interesting insight into how the Bible was composed and what's in it. And once again, we're going to be back at the book of Genesis, the very beginning of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And I want to start out by saying this. When you study the Bible, you find that there are certain motifs, say, or certain little stories that tend to repeat themselves either directly or in a slightly changed but similar fashion throughout a particular book. And even throughout the whole, Old Testament. It's where you see it primarily. And today we're going to look at one of those kind of repeating motifs. Repeating story maybe would be the better word for it. And we're going to talk a little bit about it. I'll explain it, and then we'll just maybe see a little bit about why it's there or what it means. So for this, we're going to look at three particular chapters in Genesis. The first is in Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. And then the second is Genesis 20, verses 1 to 16. And then the last one we're going to look at is in Genesis 26, verses 1 to 33. Now, we're not going to obviously read all of that. But what we're going to do is tell you a little bit about what's happening in each of these. So, the very first one, Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. This is the story of Abram, who later becomes Abraham, and his wife Sarai, who later becomes known as Sarah. And you'll remember Abraham is the man, the prophet, to whom God has promised that he will be the father of a great people. And God has made this covenant with Abraham and with the people that will be coming. And Genesis, the early parts of the Abram story tell a lot about him moving around from place to place because God is directing his movements. God and social events that are happening around him. So one of the things that happens is there's a famine in the land. And this would be when Abram was in the area of Canaan. And there was a famine, so no food, not enough food to go around. So Abram moves to Egypt. Egypt, and you'll remember this from the story of Joseph, which we covered in some depth in church a couple weeks ago. Egypt is a place where people would often go to find refuge in a famine because quite often there was food there when there wasn't in other places. Part of that, I'm assuming, is because they had the Nile River there. That was a pretty darn dependable water source for them, so you could almost always count on having water for food crops. So there's a famine. Abram and Sarai go down to Egypt. And here we're told that Sarai, we learn that she's very beautiful. And when they enter Egypt, or as they're entering Egypt, Abram says to her, "Hey, by the way, if anybody asks, you're my sister." Now, why would he say that? Genesis explains. He was concerned that if Sarai was seen as his wife, the Egyptians would kill him and take her. Presumably was not worried that if she was his sister, they would kill him and take her. I'm not sure about the cultural do's and don'ts surrounding that, but that didn't seem to be an issue. So they arrive in Egypt, and Pharaoh immediately notices that Sarai is beautiful. And in response to that, the Pharaoh's court just starts showering Abram with treasures. Gold, silver, livestock, servants. Just keep pouring in the gifts. Or bribes, maybe. And as they give all that to Abram, they figure, well, excuse me very much, I'm sorry. They give all that treasure to Abram, and in exchange, reasonably from their point of view, they take Sarai into Pharaoh's household. And she becomes part of the household, which is a euphemism for she becomes one of his wives. And you might think that was distressing, and I'm sure it was for Abram and Sarai. But remember, this promise has been made to Abram that he's going to be the father of a great nation. If he's going to be the father of a great nation, he's going to need a great wife. So God sends a plague to Egypt. Not unlike the plague that would come along later in the time of Moses. But in this case, it's just a single plague that comes along. It strikes Egypt. It strikes Pharaoh. And in the course of events, Pharaoh discovers that Sarai is indeed Moses' wife and not his daughter. And he basically says, what the heck are you doing to me? You're making me commit adultery, which is a stretch. But he immediately repents of what he's done. He gives Sarai back to Moses, and he kicks them out of Egypt. Gently, because they can take everything that they've got, that they acquired while they were there. They can take it with them, but they have to leave. And in that, we'll come back to this. Second story, Genesis 20, chapter 20, verses 1 to 16, it's pretty darn similar. In this case, Abram goes down to the southern region of Gerar Park. Well, that's another one. And there's a king there named Abimelech. And Abraham at this point, talking to Abimelech, says, by the way, the woman over there, that's my sister. That's not my wife. So Abimelech, drawn to her great beauty again, tries to take Sarah as his wife. Tries pretty assertively, apparently. And then, after that happens, Abimelech discovers the truth that Sarah is indeed Abraham's wife. And once again, there's that conversation where he goes, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't sign up for this. And he starts giving Abraham stuff. Once again, it says, Abimelech then restores Sarah to Abraham and gives him gifts of livestock and servants to apologize. And also allows Abraham to reside anywhere in Gerar. And he also gives 1,000 pieces of silver to Abraham, which makes him pretty rich at that point. Abraham, in turn, prays to God and asks God to allow Abimelech and his concubines and wife and family and all that to have children of their own. And that does happen. So that story ends well. Now a third time. This time it's not Abraham, it's Isaac, Abraham's son. You remember Isaac from Monday. He's the son that, Abraham was directed to go sacrifice or offer up for sacrifice. But Isaac also goes to Gerar, not Jarak, Gerar, old eyes. Goes to Gerar, runs into King Abimelech, and at God's suggestion, God is whispering into Isaac's ear at this point. Well, Isaac states that Rebekah, his wife, is really his sister. And again, he does this because he's worried that he will be killed and his wife taken from him. Now, in this case, Abimelech doesn't take Rebekah, but he does allow them to live there. But then Abimelech spots Isaac and Rebekah doing things that only a married couple would do. And he goes to them and says, "Hey, what's going on?" And he explains, he comes to understand that Rebekah is the wife, not the sister. Surprise. And then he orders that Rebekah be left alone. Everybody in Gerar, he puts out the notice, nobody touches Rebekah on pain of death. And they spend a year there. Eventually he becomes wealthy, and then Abimelech, because he becomes jealous that Isaac has become wealthy, kicks them out of Gerar. So, similar type story that happens 3 times. What is the reason for this? There's a couple of possibilities. The first is that it happened once, and then got, as time went on, and remember these things weren't being written down at the time, but it's possible that it happened once, and then details got to be a little bit hazy, so it got retold, and then retold a third time. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that it's kind of a hazy recollection of the idea that women, wives, and daughters, they were owned by their husbands. It's not a nice way to think about it, but that's basically true. And quite often in these times, 3,000 years ago, up until even medieval times, that somebody's daughter would be offered to the king of another country or a higher up in another country as sort of a guarantee of a treaty. In this case, Abraham would say, "Look, I'm just here, because we want to eat and we want to be peaceful here. We're not up to anything. So here's a guarantee that we're on the up and up." And he gives his sister away as the guarantee. And only later does it come to light that, gosh, that's not his sister, that's his wife. And, that's how the story goes. And that one sort of makes sense. Now, the other interesting thing is that we also learn in the first episode that not only are they husband and wife, but they are also brother and sister, sort of, Abraham and Sarah, because Sarah is his half-sister. So it would be entirely reasonable that, reasonable in a suspicious way, that Abraham would say, well, she's my sister. No, it's not my wife, that's my sister. And not be lying, but not exactly be telling the whole truth either. And in fact, there are Bible commentators that will say, confronted with the idea that Abraham lied, will say, well, no, he didn't really lie, because that was his sister. It's just that she was more than a sister as well. And to me, that seems like a pretty darn fine line to be treading. So I don't think we can excuse it on that basis. So we're left with the idea that either this is kind of a recollection of this idea of giving a daughter or a sister in guarantee of a treaty, or it's something that happened once and it was kind of an emergency and then it gets told and retold. Or the other possibility is, hey, Abraham was doing what he needed to do to get by. And yes, it was kind of sneaky. Yes, by modern standards of how we treat women, it wasn't appropriate, but it was entirely appropriate within the context of the time. And that may be where we end up. Because there is, in the Old Testament, repeatedly this sort of admiration for the writer of some of their ancestors being very sneaky about things, being clever and being wily. Also, in other terms, being con men, basically. So, it's a really interesting little tidbit from the Old Testament, I think. Once again tells us these were real people doing real things, and they were not always the most upstanding people, but they were still doing what God was directing them to do in the long haul. They were still going to be the vessels by which God, created his people, his covenant people. And it's a reminder that God can use anybody. And we get reminded of that repeatedly also throughout the Old Testament and in the New. So, I have run on again. So that's it for Wildcard Wednesday. I hope you enjoyed this little dip into the weeds here. And if you want to look these up and read the stories yourself, they are in Genesis 12 and Genesis 20 and Genesis 26. So, have a great afternoon, great rest of the week, stay healthy, stay safe. We'll see you in church on Sunday, either live or either in person or online. This coming Sunday is a communion Sunday, so if you're watching from home, please be sure to have the elements with you if you want to partake in communion with us. Hope to see you there. And hope to see you back here next Monday for Bible Story Children's Time. Be safe.